Well, that's all clean now. I think that is pretty much ready to paint. Now I'll just have to go over it and check all the details to make sure that all the edges are prepared to my satisfaction, and I'll degrease this thoroughly and get a coat of primer on it. Of course, I've got the body stripped, but I've also got other parts that are going to need painted on this camera. So I've got them sitting here at the moment. The front door, these pieces, the metal pieces, will be easy enough to deal with. The front door, I'm going to have to strip that leather off there. And this is obviously steel, that's quite rusty, it'll need a fair bit of cleaning up. These pieces are aluminium. This is bashed about. It'll need a little bit of panel beating work to get that straight. That whole top edge is pretty brutalised. It's damaged here too. It's difficult to know how it got into that state. This piece, this is the finder. It looks a little bit pushed in at the top edge there, so you can see that line's not dead straight. That's not particularly offensive. It may or may not press out. These little components, that doesn't really require any sort of finish. That's internal because that's underneath the top cover. This is the plate that the finder sits up on, and this is the plate from underneath the finder. This plate sits on top of this plate and is screwed to the top of the casting, and then the finder pops on the top. Now these pieces only need to be blackened for neat and tidiness purposes really, particularly this one. You could blacken that with a marker pen, it wouldn't be any problem. You will see this exposed edge here on the camera, so that's worth painting just to clean that up. So those are the pieces that I need to deal with. But this piece, this is by far the most difficult to deal with, and it's difficult to deal with because unlike later retinas where the leather just sat on the back in between two rails on the pressing of the back, on these cameras the leather wraps right around the edges and the leather is very, very thin. It's paper thin. I really do need to get it off because you can see those ice bumps there. There'll be lumps and bumps of corrosion under there. This is not something I would normally tackle. I think I've only ever done it a couple of times before. Generally speaking, if you get one that's as ugly as sin like this one, your easiest course of action is to find a parts camera and steal a good one from that. Of course, it does have the serial number for the camera stamped on the back, but that's life. So this, yes, getting the leather off this, what can you do? Well, what I'm doing here, because I've already made a start on this, is I started on the corner here and I worked my scalpel underneath it and lifted that leather free. There's a lot of corrosion and rubbish underneath that leather, so some of it will probably lift off easier than the rest, but this is very, very slow going and I have to be careful not to cut right through the leather. And because the leather's old and dry, you could just snap it off too, and I don't want to do that. So I'm working my way along and I've already got about as far as here. Now in an ideal world you'd have something there that would dissolve away the adhesive from underneath and the leather would just peel away. I'm not sure what they used. I don't really think it was shellac, even though it might look like that. It seems to be a bit more resistant to alcohol than that. So anyway, what I'm doing here is I'm using naphtha or isopropyl alcohol just to soak that whole leather edge, just so that the edge of that leather is slightly less stiff, and it allows me to work my scalpel blade under it. And at the moment, as you can see, I'm about halfway along one side of the door. I've got to do exactly the same on the other side of the door, and then I've got to get the leather back off here. So it's unclear whether I will have success or not at this stage. I really am just working absolutely tiny areas as I go along. But hopefully I'll get these edges finished and see how I get on about peeling it off the back. Well, that went fairly smoothly. I only have one casualty. This tiny piece of leather at the corner here came off. But I have got that peeled back from the edges, and now I will work to make sure it really is free at the edges, and then work from one end and start peeling it back. I've got this loose and I'm at the end, and I'm just trying to work my scalpel underneath the leather, hopefully going to go along the whole length of the back and peel off the other side and have the leather completely free of the camera. But it's not easy going. There's a lot of corrosion here. As you can see, this white stuff coming out, that's corrosion. And it's quite gritty. It makes it hard for the scalpel to slide in underneath. So I'll just tip a bit of naphtha down under there, which won't do anything to dissolve adhesive or any helpful thing like that, but it will make it easier for me to slide my scalpel blade along there. It acts as a lubricant. And hopefully I can work my way along the whole back of the camera. Well, I'm getting closer. You can see this is where the big Zeiss bumps on the back of the leather were here. You can see all this crap on the back of the leather and on the back of the body casting. This is where the rivets came through. The rivets would have been brass, possibly nickel plated brass. The door, of course, itself is aluminium. There are doubtless salts left in the leather after the tanning process. You get a little bit of moisture in there, and you've got like a galvanic cell. The leather is particularly tough to get out off where it's wrapped around the body edges, of course. But it is coming away. And here you can see I'm trying very hard to cut through the glue layer, really. That's why you hear the scalpel scraping against the metal body, rather than having the scalpel scrape between the leather and the glue, which would be, you'd be in constant risk of cutting through the leather. And it's fair to say that most of the action here is levering the leather off the body rather than cutting anything. The scalpel acts as a wedge. It's stuck right here. Better keep working away at that. And that, I think, is it. That's my piece of leather. That's the camera back. The camera back to be cleaned up. There's a little bit of corrosion in there on the inside. I'll probably just paint that. I'm not going to strip the inside of the door. The outside of the door, I will just get that clean. You can see at the ends of the body we've got the brass, the nickel plated brass ends on that back, and the adhesive sticks differently to places like that than it does to the aluminium. Now there must be a chemical reason for that the adhesive remains bonded to one surface better than the other, depending on the metal that's there. Anyway, this I'll have to clean up and get ready for painting. Let's have a look at this front door while we're here. And this, of course, is the last piece of leather I'm going to have to lift off this camera, and I expect this to be much simpler. It's quite brittle. I can see and hear the cracks as I get under this leather. Stuck right on this corner. Yeah, it's lifting off. Okay, there's our piece of leather. Now that looks pretty ugly, but I can tell you when that's glued back, cleaned and glued back onto the door, once everything's stripped and all the rust off it, it's been repainted and so forth, and that leather's glued back on there, and I've run a bit of leather dye on it, it'll look acceptable. It'll never look like new. I expect you're full of enthusiasm to find out how I go about painting stuff when I have to for jobs like this camera. Well, I'm not going to film that today. It's a terrible business filming that down in my basement. It's like the black hole of Calcutta down there. But I have got a video about how I go about doing the painting on cameras, and I will include a link in the description for this video, so look for it there. Well, I have the body cleaned up and ready to put everything back in it now. So I'm going to start with the bracket here, the little lock that holds the front of the camera closed. So I'm taking a little bit of synthetic grease, just run some through the fork there, some on the top of that, Next it's got to go underneath the spring, and a very light wipe on the back. This fits over the stud there. It has to go underneath this spring. Like that. And then we've got the button to screw back in. Well, the button I thought had snapped off when I was taking it out, but that wasn't the case at all. It's a very short thread, and I think the button was just reluctant to come out of the bottom of the camera. To get this started, that's better. And I'll just tighten that button down now. That's it. That's good. And that's our catch for the front of the camera. So that part's dealt with. Here, let's get the tripod socket back in place. 3 screws hold this in place. Flathead screws. All the mechanical components here have been through a vigorous cleaning process in the ultrasonic cleaner, in a bath of wax and grease remover. They got 10 minutes of that, and that was followed by 10 minutes in hot water with a strong solution of domestic detergent, ammonia based detergent. So there's our tripod socket back in place. At the top of the camera, I think we can have the rewind back in position. So here is the bush. Oh, that's the advance. Here is the bush for the rewind. And I'll lubricate before I put that back together. Let's lubricate this with a bit of synthetic grease. I'll just lift that tab slightly with the tip of the screwdriver, just to make it easier to push the shaft back in place, and that can go back on the top of the camera. This goes on there. Got 2 screws. Flathead screws. And I can put the rewind knob back on top. Just put something through the fork to stop it turning, and just finger tight. That's the rewind back in place. I need to put the struts back in place. they're all cleaned. I'll lubricate these with some synthetic grease in these slots here and here and fit this into position. Check that that folds nicely. It's nice and smooth in its action. This goes in here. Now the closed side of the loop goes to the rewind. So it fits in there like that. One screw at the top here, a matching one at the bottom, and two in the film cassette chamber. One of these is probably a bit uglier than its mates. That was down under the leather. We'll put that back there. Now the two in the film cassette, well, be my lucky day. Doing it in a position like this where I can't see what's happening. You've got to be exceptionally lucky for the screws to start straight away. But they are. Okay, so I'll just tighten those 4 screws up. That's the struts back in place. Should open and close smoothly enough. They seem to. You may have noticed that the bellows in there are looking in particularly fine condition. That's because they're not the original bellows. I did take the original bellows out with a view to patching them because they were gone at the corner. But as you can see, they weren't just gone at the corner. This whole front piece here was still doing it. It was just falling apart. So the bellows were a total loss. And I stole the bellows out of a Retina 1A camera, I think it was. Out of the body of a Retina 1A camera that was in my parts pile. And that'll do the job nicely. So we've got the bellows in there. We've got to put all the focus mount stuff in here next. Well, here are the 3 main pieces. We've got to get the inner and outer helical together and get them correctly oriented so that they were exactly where they started off before I took it apart. Okay, so I've got that started. And my alignment marks, I've got a V scratched in here on the inner helical, and I've got a little horizontal single check over here on the outer helical. And when these are level, when it's down level, when those front surfaces are flush, those 2 marks should be aligned. Well, now they're not. This one's round here, this one is on round here, so I need to start the inner helical back round about almost a quarter of a turn if I'm coming in from the front. So these threads are dry. They may not pick up easily. Let's see where we are. So my inner helical, the tick marks here, on the outer helical, the tick marks there. So I need to come back a little bit further than that again. And this is just changing the point where they come together. Now there, I'm getting close. If I'm level at the front, one tick marks here, one's there, so I need to come back one more, I think, and then I should be done. These are multi-start threads. There's a lot of starts. There's about, I haven't counted them, might be 16 positions. I just need to come back one more position. Not here. Okay, it's out. Now I need to get the thing started. Let's try it there. Now I'm too low. So I most definitely need to be round this way further. I'm coming back the other way. That might be it. Now it looks high. I've got to come back from there. That's it. That's where I wanted to be. I'll zoom you in a little bit. Here's my two marks. Little V-shaped mark on the inner and a little tick mark on the outer. And the front surface is dead level. That's exactly where that needed to be. Now I want to lubricate this. It's easiest to assemble it, lubricate it afterwards. You can lubricate them first, but you just end up with grease all over your fingers. So, let's get on to that. I'm taking some helical grease. This stuff is Helimax XP optical and instrument helical grease, it's called. I'm putting probably too much in about 5 places all around the outside, and then I'll work that in, check the action. It's nice and smooth, it's not too stiff. If you get too much grease in there, it'll actually stiffen the movement up. It won't help you at all. Okay, and here's our front standard, if you like, or at least the holder for this. This notch, that goes to the top. Now our little tick marks, they also went to the top from memory. I'll check. Yes, that would certainly be the case. So, I'll just take a little bit of the grease, and I'm just going to wipe a little bit on the inside there. And these two slots, just give that a wipe. That's where those slots line up with those pins, and that's what guides the inner helical. So I'll just get this in position. It should just drop in like that. I can check the action. Make sure that that moves smoothly, and it does. That feels great. Well, that's ready to go back into the camera really. We've got this felt piece here. This went on the back of here and against the bellows. So I will just put this in place. you can see the remains of the old adhesive and so forth on there. I'll put a couple of dots of glue on there just to keep it in place while I'm assembling it. But to be quite frank, once it's assembled you wouldn't need to do anything. So I'll find the adhesive and I'll just put a couple of spots on there.